Okay, we're just a couple of minutes after 4:30, so I want to get us going, particularly out of respect for the time that our legislative partners are giving us this afternoon and gratitude for them joining us. My name is Kinsey Hasted. I'm the State and Local Policy Director for Enterprise Community Partners. And on behalf of all of my organizational colleagues and our legislators joining us today, we really appreciate everyone joining us this afternoon for discussion on Senate Bill 173 and how this important and critical piece of legislation will keep Help Coloradans housed. I want to start with just a couple of housekeeping notes for folks who are joining us and in need of Spanish interpretation. We are not using the Zoom interpretation link today. We're doing it through a phone line. Cecia, the phone line is, are you able to drop that in the chat for folks who might need that? Thank you. And our thanks to Christian for serving as our interpreter this afternoon. I'd also like to share that this is a webinar format, and so only panelists are able to turn their cameras on and speak. If you're joining us as a participant today, we welcome your questions. Please do use the Q&A function in Zoom, not the chat that's disabled in this format, and we will be happy to get to those as we are able. And thank you to Cecia for dropping the number and access code for folks seeking Spanish interpretation this afternoon. So I'm going to start by welcoming and introducing the lead legislative sponsors of this legislation. Senator Julie Gonzalez, Representative Serena Gonzalez-Gutierrez, and Representative Yadira Caraveo. Thank you all for being here. And I know that Representative Gonzalez-Gutierrez is waiting to take a vote right now and joining us. So I wanted to turn it over to you, Representative, to get us starting about why you're involved in this bill and its importance to you.
Thank you so much, Kinsey. And I am just really excited to be here with all of these amazing folks who have been working for months on this very issue. And I know that I think we collectively all agree that housing is a human right and that it is a public health issue, right? And that through the pandemic, we have seen far too many families lose their homes. And that is especially true in communities of color. Everything starts in the home. I often talk about my experience in my other job working with children, youth, and families that are involved in different systems. A lot of times we see a lot of truancy type of cases. And in those cases, I can tell you that more often than not, the main contributor to kids not going to school or missing school is because of housing instability, housing insecurities, because families either have been evicted, are not sure if they can make the next month's rent, and we're just one organization that's trying to help remedy those issues, and there's only so much funds we have and only so much we can do. And I can't imagine that those families are sitting there thinking, okay, I got to get my kid to school, but I don't know where we're going to lay our head at night. And so I can't imagine, what families are going through right now that are doing virtual learning or trying to do virtual learning while worrying about where they're going to do virtual learning from, with concerns of housing. I'm a mom, I have 3 kids, and they've been doing virtual learning this entire time. And I cannot imagine what that would be like. We know that too many families are evicted for small things. And that is why I am really proud to stand with my colleagues, fellow members of the Latino Caucus, as a sponsor of Senate Bill 21-173 to keep Coloradans housed. I want to talk just briefly about issues around late fees, and that late fees are a contributor to pricing Colorado families out of their homes. This was a problem before COVID and has continued to be a problem and even worsen. And so we want to continue to work on that type of work. Some of the things that we have seen is landlords charging late fees as high as 30% of the rent. And in a state where renters can be evicted for late fees alone, that is absolutely unacceptable. Our community partners have told us of cases where a renter had fallen behind in rent due to COVID. The rent was $1,200 a month, that renter was 2 months behind in rent. The total the landlord was charging and what they had to pay to stay in their home was $4,000 because the landlord charged this person $800 a month in late fees. This was totally legal because there is no limit right now in state law on how much or how often landlords can assess a late fee. This renter was almost forced out of their home for late fees alone. Our bill will prevent evictions for late fees alone, put a cap on those fees, and a mandatory grace period for fees before fees can be charged so that late fees alone do not force families from their homes. Senate Bill 173 will keep Coloradans housed. And like I said, it's awesome to be here with Representative Caraveo, Senator Gonzalez, and Senator Moreno, who may or may not be able to join us, but they're all awesome. I'm going to hand it over to Representative Caraveo.
Thank you, Representative. And as Representative Gonzalez Gutierrez mentioned, housing is a human right, and that is especially true during the COVID pandemic. You know, a year ago this month, Colorado entered into an unprecedented time along with the rest of the world, where health and safety takes priority over everything else. While we know more than we did a year ago about the COVID virus, we are still not completely in the clear yet. Colorado families need homes to safely socially distance and remain safe from the virus. The link between remaining housed and staying healthy has never been more clear. A recent study from the National Bureau of Economic Research found that policies limiting evictions resulted in a 4% decline in COVID infections and an 11% decline in COVID deaths. I'm a pediatrician, and so I know that ensuring that keeping Coloradans housed, that's really one of the reasons that I am on this bill, because housing is healthcare. Evictions lead to long-term negative health outcomes and increased risk of contracting and spreading COVID-19, which we know has a direct tie to a wide range of physical and mental health issues. Senate Bill 173 will keep families in their homes by giving renters more time to catch up on their rent before the sheriff comes to their door to evict them. If you've lost your job or have reduced hours due to COVID, or are otherwise unable to pay your full rent, this bill will provide you with additional time to come up with those funds. Rental assistance is taking 6 to 8 weeks after people apply for it. The eviction timeline is faster right now than the rental assistance timeline. We need to give Coloradans more time to come up with the funds to keep them in their homes. Now I'll turn this over to our incredible state Senate sponsor, Senator Gonzalez.
You're muted.
Thank you so much, Representante Doctora Caraveo, Representante Gonzalez Gutierrez. Thanks to this amazing coalition for doing all that you are in order to lift up and remind Colorado that housing is an essential need. My name is Julie Gonzalez, and I am honored to represent North, West, and Downtown Denver in the State Senate. And I also have the honor of serving as the Majority Caucus Chair for our Senate Democratic majority. And I will say that I understand just how essential housing is, because I live in an affordable housing unit myself, and I see just how transformative access to stable housing can be. And yet, Colorado is one of the worst states in the country if you're a renter facing eviction. We're in the bottom 10 states in the country when it comes to laws that protect renters. And so for me, as a vice chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, making sure that we're leveling the playing field and ensuring that people remain in their homes in the midst of a pandemic, particularly, but that making sure that that we have a level playing field at all times, to me, is about basic fairness in this eviction process. I want to tell y'all a story. I heard this story about a single mother of 2 kids over in Arapahoe County. She had her apartment flood. So she asks her landlord to do something about the resulting damage. She didn't get any response. The apartment became unlivable, and much of her property was destroyed. And then she later lost her job due to COVID and then fell behind in her rent. These are impossible situations that Coloradans are navigating on the day-to-day basis. When she was evicted due to her non-payment of rent, she was informed by her attorney that she could not bring up the apartment's condition in her eviction unless she paid thousands of dollars of fees with the court. That basically priced her out of access to justice. Our legislation gets rid of that requirement that people have to pay essentially all of the rent that they owe in order to be able to bring up a health and safety defense in an eviction case. I don't think it's too much to ask. We've seen other states do this. Oklahoma, South Carolina, North Dakota, California. Those are all states that don't require these onerous provisions. Senate Bill 173 will begin to provide more solutions to level the playing field and keep Coloradans housed. Now, because I'm honored to work alongside Senator Dominic Moreno from Adams County on this bill, the guy's still in the Joint Budget Committee at the moment. And so I'm going to just talk a little bit about a couple of other provisions of the policy. And so, you know, the other point that I'll just name is the fact that Black and Brown Coloradans have been hit particularly hard during this pandemic. And housing has been an issue for those communities, as well as for low-income, working-class Coloradans long before COVID. And so a couple of points that Senate Bill 173 also seeks to address. In those specifically in non-payment eviction cases, we believe that renters should be allowed to stop the eviction process by just paying the landlord what they owe. This provision would buy renters the critical time without placing new additional burdens on the landlord. We feel that we should be doing everything in our power to prevent those avoidable evictions by giving the renters the time that they need to pay back their rent so that more Coloradans stay housed. Another provision that's really important is the fact that landlords often lock out renters without going through the actual court, the traditional court processes. And current statute means that the way that current statute reads, the tenant's only allowed to receive very limited damages. This is particularly prevalent in communities of color and immigrant communities where landlords take advantage of that power imbalance. And so Senate Bill 173 seeks to create a statutory penalty, a significant one, so that in the event that a landlord locks out a renter without going through that normal court process, that penalty will serve to compensate renters who are illegally locked out, and quite frankly, disincentivize landlords from engaging in that predatory and illegal practice in the first place. And so that is the work that brings us to this point today. And so I'm also just really honored to work alongside such a strong coalition. And with this, I will kick it back to the team. Kinsey, go ahead.
I can take it, Senator. Thank you all so much. We are all so grateful for each of your passion and commitment and understanding of the importance of your issues and your leadership on this important bill, as well as many others having to do with keeping Coloradans housed, both through the time of COVID and an equitable recovery. So thank you sincerely from all of us for your leadership and for joining us today. We are seeing questions coming in through the Q&A function. I think we're going to have some of our colleagues from supporting organizations speak a bit more to the specific provisions of the bill first, and then we will move into fielding some of the questions, but please feel free to keep them coming. So first, I'd like to hand it over to Cecia from 9 to 5 Colorado, She's going to share with us some of the importance behind provisions imposing reasonable statutory restrictions on the late fees that landlords can charge tenants. Cecia?
Hey everyone, thanks for the invitation and thanks for being here today with us. I'm super excited that this bill, SB21-173, is coming forward. 9 to 5 is a grassroots women's state organization that works on economic justice, and we believe that housing justice is gender justice. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about why this is important. I think our amazing sponsors and champions of the bill have addressed like why this is super important, right? What we're trying to do with late fees is, one, have transparency. We just want to make sure that these fees are in your lease so that you are aware of them and that there is not a surprise when there's a practice, right? When you know how much you're going to be charged. The other piece is just putting some caps on the percentage and the dollar amount that a late fee can be charged. All we're trying to do is making sure that these fees are not predatory. We have seen our members fall into a cycle of debt and fall into a cycle of eviction. And right now in Colorado, as our sponsors mentioned, folks can be evicted for owing late fees alone. And we just want to make sure that there is consistency and uniformity across the state to make sure that there is a cap and that there is a grace period. I'm sure some of y'all have seen that throughout the past 12 months, Governor Polis has issued different executive moratoriums that have prohibited charging late fees because they really can add up. This is also the one recommendation that the eviction task force back in the fall that was appointed to talk about evictions. You know, what is one thing that the legislature could do? And late fees was one of them. We have done our research. We know that this is a problem all across the state. This isn't just a Denver metro area issue. There are companies that operate all over the state where this is an issue. And we also want to uplift that for us, some of these changes with late fees and with eviction and court reform, it's also, it is a housing justice issue, it's a gender justice issue, and it's a racial justice issue. 1 in 5 renters were late on their rent during the pandemic, with Black and Latino renters being most impacted. And so we want to make sure that that's uplifted. And we really think that these changes or that these things that we're working on should apply to all landlords across the board. We hear, sometimes the way that this can impact small landlords, and we understand that. And sometimes we also have to go back to our history and look at when certain landlords or when number of landlords are exempted, where does that come from, and where do we find that? And we have found that sometimes certain carve-outs or exemptions really have history on racist policies where Black renters, people of color, Jewish renters, really, it was to keep them out, right? And while maybe that may not be the intent in 2021 and 2020, we just don't want to continue to perpetuate those practices. If we're going to talk about housing justice, we want to do it in a way that is also doing it through a racial justice lens. So I'm super stoked to be part of this team. And we just want to make sure that people are stayed housed, especially now. It's been 12 months, but I know that all of us are probably still feeling the impacts of what COVID has felt like. Last year, this was the last normal week that a lot of us have had in 12 months, but we know there's still a long road to recovery. So thank you, Kinsey.
Thank you very much, Cecia. And now I'm going to hand it over to Javier, who's with the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project and helping to keep folks who've been negatively impacted by COVID housed, particularly through the court and legal process. Javier is one of our amazing, intelligent, and active lawyers helping to represent folks in the court system. So Javier, do you want to speak some to the reform issues in eviction court that Senate Bill 173 would bring and the importance of those pieces?
Yeah, and thank you, Kinsey, and thank you, everybody, for attending today. We are really excited about this legislation. As Senator Gonzalez mentioned, Colorado is one of the worst states in the country for renters. And, you know, as Rep. Gonzalez Gutierrez said, housing is a human right. And for me, this issue is very personal. I was evicted when I was a teenager, and in the aftermath of that, I ended up dealing with housing instability and dropped out of high school. You cannot attend school without a stable home. So housing is an issue that impacts every single aspect of our lives. And so I went to law school to become an eviction defense attorney to defend families like mine from getting evicted. And one of the fast lessons that I learned starting this work in Colorado is that renters do not have much of a leg to stand on. So I work with the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project. We started last April representing tenants here in Colorado. And since then, we've provided some sort of direct legal representation to more than 1,200 Coloradans. You know, thanks to various eviction moratoriums, those put in place at the state level and some put in place at the federal level, we've been able to defend our clients pretty successfully. But that's only due to those moratoriums. If we did not have those tools, I feel like it would often be my job to convey bad news to my clients. And so now I just want to go through a few provisions in this legislation and talk about how these reforms will make Colorado a more accessible state for renters. So the first major thing that this legislation does is it gives renters more time to catch up on their back rent and avoid eviction. So right now in Colorado, the eviction process starts when a landlord puts a notice on your door if you haven't paid your rent. Those notices are 10 days. It is a 10-day notice to pay your rent or quit. On that 11th day, you're out, no matter what. Even if you come up with all your rent, your landlord can, and trust me, they do, refuse to accept your rent, and they move forward with the eviction process. What our legislation does is it lets you pay your rent at any point during the eviction process, right? Your landlord is claiming this is about non-payment of rent. If you can come up with the money before the court concludes its process, we think that that is completely fair, that you should be able to remain in your home. So that's the first piece of reform that we're seeking to address. The other one, and you know, I will only touch on this briefly because Senator Gonzalez explained it very well, has to do with bond requirements. Basically, these are big fees that tenants have to pay to play. Colorado courts say, if you want to bring up things that your landlord has done in your eviction case, you have to post bond with the court. That bond is typically set at an amount that tenants cannot afford, right? Like imagine you lost your job due to COVID, you get evicted for non-payment of rent, and then the court says, okay, you have something to say about the condition of your apartment, you have to pay us $1,500 or $2,000. That makes court inaccessible, and it's unjust, and this is about basic fairness. Tenants should be able to bring up things that went wrong in their tenancy when they're getting evicted for non-payment of rent. So in the next major thing that the legislation does has to do with predatory clauses in leases that punish renters above and beyond the normal eviction process. So right now it's completely legal in Colorado for your landlord to include a clause in your lease that says, if you violate your lease, I, the landlord, am owed an additional $4,000. My good friend Aubrey, fellow presenter here today, has a clause like this in her lease. If she lost her job and got evicted due to COVID, the landlord is way more likely to see the eviction process through to the end and not negotiate with her because they know that they can get a judgment for that extra $4,000. And so we want to make these clauses prohibited so that landlords cannot contract additional incentives to evict into leases. The next thing that this legislation does has to do with illegal lockouts, and Senator Gonzalez also did a great job of covering this, but right now in Colorado, if you evict your tenant without going through the normal court process, you do violate the law. But Colorado law says the renter is only owed economic damages. Well, what does that mean? Well, I'm reminded of a story a good friend told me where a tenant got evicted through this process. They got illegally locked out, and the landlord threw away all of the tenant's possessions, including the remains of the tenant's father. The tenant had an urn with the father's ashes in the house, and the landlord threw it away. Well, in Colorado, if you bring a case for unlawful eviction and sue the landlord and win, if that happened, you would be owed nothing because it's not an economic damage. And so our law creates clear statutory penalties where this happens to disincentivize that type of behavior and to give renters the ability to assert their rights. So with that, I'll pass it back to Kinsey. Thank all of you for attending today.
Thank you so much, Javier. I have learned so much from you and others along the course of this process, just how skewed toward landlords the eviction court process is, and really hope that we can pass this bill to bring some greater parity and equity between landlords and tenants. Thank you for that. I'd like to welcome Kyle Hulsman now, the Senior Director of Legislative Affairs with the State Innovation Exchange. Kyle has good news for us in that it turns out that Colorado voters largely support all of the provisions in this bill. So Kyle, would you like to tell us a bit more about what you found?
Awesome, thanks for having me. And indeed, good news, we are winning and people care about this. It is no surprise to anybody that there are huge numbers of renters in the states facing, massive economic hardship around the COVID recession, and folks see it. They experience it every day. The number of people who are citing housing as a crisis has increased dramatically over the last year, and folks see it on the ground. They see it in their individual leases. They see it in their interactions with landlords. This matters, and people understand why this is important. So just a couple of high-level numbers to sort of round out what this looks like. 80% of Colorado voters support capping how much landlords can charge in late fees. And of that, 75% support capping it at 2.5%. That's compared to 70% at 5% cap. What that means is folks really want to see bold progressive reforms around housing, and there is a clear mandate to move forward with these types of policies. On the broader court eviction side, similar numbers here. 2/3 of voters say that renters need more due process protection in eviction cases. And to put a finer point on that, 76% say that tenants should have more than 10 days to catch up on back rent. 82% support updating the law to allow courts to impose financial penalties on landlords who illegally lock out their tenants. 82% of people don't agree on anything. This is not typical numbers that you see. This is not typical polling that you see. These are literally majorities of Republicans, unaffiliated, and Democratic voters all coming together, saying that these reforms are necessary and important. So I would just leave us with, this is a mandate from voters. This is extraordinarily clear response that we are in a housing crisis and that we need immediate action to support renters and support folks who have been pushed to the margins because of the economic recession. So thank you all so much for having me, and I'm so excited to see where this bill goes.
Thank you for joining us this afternoon, Kyle, and thank you to SIX for collaborating in that important research and letting us know that this bill and our legislative sponsors are heading in the direction that Colorado voters want. That's good news, like we said. So now I'm going to pass it to Aubrey Hasvold with the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless to share a little bit on next steps and what folks can do to help support passage of this legislation.
All right, thank you so much, Kinsey. Thank you to our sponsors and all of the amazing partners here on this call today. I'm so impressed to see 80 people here. This is fantastic. So we just really want to communicate to you all that your opinion and your voice matter, and we need you all to step up and make it clear to your own elected leaders, as well as elected leaders who are going to vote in committee on this bill, that you care about this, it matters, it'll make a difference in your life, and it'll strengthen your community. So we'll provide all of the tools you need in a follow-up email so that you know who to contact, when to contact them, and how. We'll also provide some templates so that you can use social media to elevate this issue and call it out and tag the right folks. And then what I'm also going to do is drop in the chat here a link so that you can sign on in support of this bill. So keep an eye out for that. I'll be dropping that right now. So check that out. There's a lot you can do to help make sure that we're successful with this bill. We'll also follow up with some information on the broader Renters Roundtable platform. There are a lot of great housing bills being worked on this year. And while we don't probably have time to talk about them all tonight, would love to get you all engaged in this whole suite of reforms that can really balance the power between landlords and tenants. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Aubrey. And thank you to all of our panelists and legislators joining us this evening. We are ready to do some Q&A, and I thought that I would put the first one to Cecia, actually, and any of the legislators who wanted to additionally comment. We have a question. I know that we heard some comments from Kyle on exactly what caps are supported by Colorado voters on late fees. Wanted to also make sure we mentioned that this was a unanimous recommendation of the Governor's Special Eviction Prevention Task Force convened last fall to impose statutory caps on late fees. But of course, the members of that task force had varying recommendations. So Cecia, we wanted to get from you what this bill would propose for renters.
Yeah, thank you. So the bill starts with the proposal of a 2.5% cap of the remaining total past due and a 14-day calendar grace days period. So that would include weekends and holidays. And as Kyle shared, that is a percentage that is supported by folks and seems to be like, a reasonable cap, where really like something I want to add is that a late fee is really not supposed to be used as a way to punish anyone and not as an incentive. It's really to make folks whole when that does happen. And that is where the bill introduction is at right now.
Thank you, Cecia. That's so helpful and much needed change, as we all know. Another question on the content of the bill, I think I may pose to Javier to begin with. Of course, welcome legislators' contributions again here. Could you describe the fines levied against landlords and the fees offered to tenants after an illegal lockout and the process for receiving justice in this issue? Javier?
Yeah, so as I mentioned previously, currently, if you are illegally locked out, you can sue your landlord for quote unquote economic damages. Now, that's very limited. And what we're trying to do is provide a method for renters to get some sort of compensation, even if they lost nothing, right? Because the fact that you're illegally locked out by your landlord should be enough for you to receive compensation. This destroys lives, right? And so what our legislation does specifically in terms of a statutory penalty is it provides that if a tenant proves that the landlord illegally locked out if a landlord illegally locked out the tenant, then the tenant is owed the greater amount of $5,000 or 3 times the rent. Now, Kenzie, I know that we were also asked about fees, and this is important. The tenant will also be able to be awarded attorney's fees if they can prove that they were illegally locked out. And now this is important because it makes the bill enforceable. It incentivizes attorneys to take on these cases, even though that amount of damages, $5,000, 3 times the rent. Typically cases like that are hard for attorneys to take on because the amount of work that you have to put in it, there's not much of an incentive there unless you're specifically allowed to get costs and fees. So we have that in the law so that attorneys are incentivized to take on these cases and that there's better enforcement.
Thanks, Javier. This is a question, I think, perhaps for our legislative sponsors here. Sorry, I'm scrolling through just a minute. So I think many folks know that a lot of individuals in the legislature are themselves landlords and might benefit financially from folks who oppose Senate Bill 173 or might have some personal interests at play. And I wonder if you can speak to this or, you know, and thinking about the environment for landlords writ large in Colorado right now and how this bill may affect them. Senator Gonzalez, look like you might want to speak.
Certainly. The vast majority of tenants and the vast majority of landlords in the state of Colorado are doing the right thing. They are, especially right now in this moment of crisis, where we have a public health crisis layered on top of an economic crisis as well. The vast majority of landlords and tenants are working it out. They are figuring out reasonable repayment plans. They are doing the right thing. We're talking, though, about what happens when things escalate to a point where we're talking about going to court. Or we're talking about a landlord who goes and illegally switches out the locks or removes somebody's appliances from their house and renders that apartment inaccessible or unlivable, right? Like that's like pretty rare circumstances that we're talking about. And so for that reason, it's why we want to make sure through this bill that the playing field is leveled for all parties. We're not trying to say, oh, the balance is like this and we want to switch it to be, no, we want it to be fair and level for everyone. I think access to justice is really important. And I think that my colleagues in both chambers, regardless of party, I think everyone can agree about that.
Thank you, Senator. Our next question, I think we'll go to Javier. Javier, can you speak to, does this legislation make landlords liable for wrongdoing under the Colorado Unfair and Deceptive Business Practices Law?
Yes, in one specific provision where a landlord illegally locks out their tenant, the Attorney General is authorized to go after that landlord under the Unfair Practices and Deceptive, the Unfair and Deceptive Business Practices Law. So that's another way that we want to disincentivize this sort of egregious behavior. You know, we find this particularly important because we see it most commonly where landlords are taking advantage of the fact that they have immigrant tenants and take advantage of the language barrier. You know, they know that their immigrant tenants are afraid to go to court. We've seen this multiple times in the past year. And so in those sort of egregious cases, it's entirely reasonable for the Attorney General to look into that.
Thanks, Javier. Very helpful for my non-lawyerly self. I appreciate it. Let's see. I wanted to, another question here is thinking through, we discussed, Senator Gonzalez in particular explained how the bill would eliminate the bond or the payment that folks would have to make in order to defend themselves through a warranty of habitability case in an eviction case. Javier, could you maybe also speak a bit more to Colorado's warranty of habitability law?
Yeah, so the warranty of habitability says that your landlord is obligated to provide you an apartment or home that is fit for human habitation. What does that mean? That means it needs certain necessary things like functioning plumbing, a working heater, working appliances, to be free from pests like bed bugs and rats, to not be flooded, for example, to be free from excessive amounts of mold. What we're trying to do here is just make it where a landlord violates that essential right. And by the way, this right exists in all 50 states. This isn't extreme. Where a landlord violates this essential right, the tenant should be able to bring it up when they're being sued by their landlord.
Thank you, Javier. Another question that I think may be for Cecia is if you would be willing to speak a little bit more to exceptions to the law, particularly with regard to late fees. So in the past, laws to help renters, unfortunately, haven't actually helped all renters. Would this bill actually help everyone, or are there specific exemptions for landlords who own a smaller number of properties like we have for eviction notices? And if not, why not?
Sure. Thank you, Kinsey. So in the past couple of years, when renters' rights bills or housing bills have been brought forward under the dome, we have seen that oftentimes there's been an exemption for anyone who owns 5 single-family homes or fewer. And again, we understand the need to hear out smaller landlords. I understand that you oftentimes, you're not working with in the same massive corporate level or with the same tools that smaller landlords are working with. When we started to do some of the research about this number 5 and kind of where this was coming from, we found what was called the Mrs. Murphy exemption, which was really created pre-civil rights movement to really exempt mostly white, old, elderly white women from having to rent to Black renters and Jewish renters. And again, we're not saying that the intent is the same again now. We just want to make sure that we are not perpetuating perhaps things that have those racist roots. I know that for me, it's been a learning process to even learn sometimes about redlining or predatory practices that have prohibited or made it an obstacle for people of color, for Black and brown folks to become homeowners. And even now, sometimes I hear terrible stories of, what folks go through in that process. And so we just want to make sure that that doesn't continue to be perpetuated. We think that these are reasonable asks and reasonable changes that both landlords and tenants can really live by.
Thanks, Cecia. And I actually have one more question that I think you might be best equipped to answer here while you're on. Will this bill also apply to mobile home parks where the rent is for the land?
Yes, thank you for raising that question. That's super important. A lot of y'all know that mobile home owners and doing housing justice for mobile home owners is also part of 9 to 5's work and vision as we've been organizing mobile home parks for the last 4 or 5 years. So all of these provisions would apply to folks who are mobile home owners. And for those of y'all who maybe are not as aware, mobile home owners own their home, but they rent the land that their home sits on. So it's a little bit of a different situation in terms of the relationship that exists, but there's still a tenants, right? They're still having to pay for that land. And while the Mobile Home Park Act is like a huge packet that regulates some of these provisions, we want to make sure that it applies across the board. Oftentimes mobile home owners are low income folks. This is one of the first or only ways that folks can afford to buy their first home. So it would also apply to them.
Thank you, Cecia. I was wondering, Representative Caraveo, if you would be willing to continue to speak just a little bit more to the public health imperative of housing, not only in this moment, but for the long term. I think we all know that COVID has certainly shone a light on housing instability and how close to eviction many folks are in the state, and has also exacerbated it. But would love some of your thoughts on the importance of housing as health, both now, but also in the long term.
Sure, that's a great question. Thank you, Kinsey. So we know that, at its most basic, having a stable housing environment provides you with the ability to socially distance, to have a place where you can be away from other people in the community and be safe, a place to wash things, and to take care of your basic hygiene, which is important for all sorts of basic health issues. There's also the stress component of not having housing that is stable. I was just reading a paper the other day showing that mothers that are evicted during their pregnancy have a much higher rate of preterm birth, and their babies tend to be smaller. And a lot of that, in addition to the environmental issues that you see with lack of housing, have to do with the stress of being unhoused or having unstable housing. And so there's all sorts of things, in particular in children, around adverse childhood events, having to do with stress and environmental changes and impacts that affect your health long term. So it's not just about having a roof over your head and having a place to socially distance and be clean, but the stress and the the everyday impact of having that instability in your life can lead to the chronic issues down the line.
Thank you, Representative. Another question, I don't know if Representative Caraveo or Sasio might want to take this, but the question is, will this bill apply to late fees on those who do not have a lease but rent month to month?
That's a great question. I believe so. I want to double check with our sponsors, and Javier help me out here because I feel like you would know the answer to this. But yeah, we'd want to make sure that it's the component of the lease is usually the way things work, right? From our experiences, you start on a lease that lasts about 12 months. And when that's not renewed, you're on a month-to-month basis. But your lease, the first time that you should sign, should have those policies named in there so that you're aware of them. Once you change month to month, you are still subject to those terms and you're aware of like what the policy is, but it would still continue to apply if I'm not mistaken. Maybe Javier can step in here and help me out.
Ceci is exactly right. When you switch over to being a month-to-month tenant, the terms of your previous lease carry over. So that's one part of this. The second part of this is, even if you never had a lease, the law assumes that you have a rental agreement. And that rental agreement is codified by performance, right? They know that you pay rent and your landlord accepts it. And then the courts say, well, your rental agreement is a reasonable rental agreement. A court would never say that a rental agreement existed that violated Colorado law. And so therefore, if we are mandating that landlords cannot charge this where there's a lease, it would also apply where there's not a lease.
Great, thank you, Javier and Cecia both. And I think we are starting to come to the end of our time together and looking, I don't see any new questions. So I did want to, especially in recognition and gratitude again for our legislative leads being here, open it up to you all to offer any final thoughts that you have on your leadership on this bill in particular, other housing efforts that you see, kind of the importance of seizing this moment for housing and making progress.
Well, I'll start. I think as with so many things in our society, COVID has uncovered what many of us already knew was a problem, but that has only been exacerbated by COVID. As was said earlier, there's a lot of interests in the Capitol that have a lot of money and a lot of power, and sometimes influence over other legislators. And not every legislator necessarily realizes the problems that we have in housing. I know last year when Representative Gonzalez Gutierrez and I brought this to committee, people were like, late fees, that's not an issue. And since then, I think they've heard from a lot more constituents, and they need to continue hearing from constituents. They need to know that what is being said in the building is not necessarily what's being felt outside of the building. And so please, please contact other legislators and talk to them about the issues that you are facing in your life every day and how stacked renters issues are for landlords and not for the people that rely on that as housing.
Representative Gonzalez Gutierrez? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just add that, as far as reaching out to your legislators, there is also opportunities to testify. And one of the things, because of COVID, we do have remote testimony available for folks, so that, if they do not feel comfortable coming down to the Capitol and actually, in order for us to maintain our social distancing, if you're able to participate remotely, that is greatly appreciated. Committees do take public testimony very serious, and they do like to hear from folks.
I'll just say from my part that that we have the opportunity to go back to normal as we recover from the impacts of the pandemic and the economic crisis, or we have the opportunity to learn from our mistakes. COVID laid bare all of these different inequities, and Representative Caraveo spoke powerfully about all of the ways that those inequalities have been laid bare, right? And so it's our job to respond and to put forward policy that that levels the playing field for everyone, that creates greater transparency, and that no disrespect to Javier, but means that everyday people, that you don't need a law degree in order to understand how these processes work, right? I hear from people who are like, hey, I had no idea that if I left, if I got evicted, I also owed these liquidated damages clauses, right? That create like a weird incentive for that narrow set of landlords to evict, right? Like, y'all, that's the work. It also helps that, as Kyle mentioned earlier, that this policy is massively popular with Coloradans. And so for all of those reasons, reach out to your legislator, share your stories, share your perspectives. That's gonna be how we all come together and make this policy happen, y'all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator. And to wrap us up, I just want to remind folks that in the Q&A part of the Zoom, there's a link to a Google Sheet that you can fill out for yourself, for your organization to endorse and stand behind this bill and the policies that our legislators are trying to change here. We will follow up certainly with you all on the bill's movement to provide opportunities for testimony. I have been testifying in front of our esteemed legislators here from my bedroom, so it can be done. And we just want to welcome, or thank you all for joining us today and welcome you to come along this journey of positive change with us. And I want to thank my colleagues from the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, from 9 to 5, the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project, who are on the panel and have shared their expertise and passion with us today. Our colleagues at the Interfaith Alliance for pulling together this excellent event, as well as other lead partners in the Colorado Center on Law and Policy and Together Colorado, who are joining us in this work. So with that, thank you all for joining us and have a lovely Tuesday evening.